I mean, I think whenever you have an IP or like a book series that is so beloved by a fan base, you have to, take that on board and realize that, there's kind of a handle with care there.
Because there are just differences of interpretation and people are emotionally attached to different things. And people really care, including us, about these universes and IPs that they're attached to. We just have to commit to making the best game we can within the context of our interpretation of the lore. And it's more important that a lot of people really love it than that absolutely everybody thinks it's okay.
The danger of adaptation is being too conservative and being overly reverent. Because I think it's safe in some respects, but I think you walk a path in which you create something that is dull and doesn't work in the medium you're creating it for.
With this 1951 letter to Collins Publishing House, J.R.R. Tolkien expressed his desire to create a fantasy universe of interconnected stories and myths. During the author's life, numerous illustrators, poets, and filmmakers made their own interpretation of Middle-earth. But at the time of Tolkien's death in 1973, video games were only a kernel of what they are now. Neither he nor fans of his work could have predicted the impact his world would later have on the interactive medium. Like many licensed properties, Tolkien's world has a spotty history of video game adaptations. The Lord of the Rings license spans almost every genre, from third-person action to real-time strategy to an RPG inspired by Final Fantasy X. The entries also vary drastically in terms of quality, with some great and others downright awful. This is due in large part to the Lord of the Rings license changing hands so many times. It's gone from Interplay to Vivendi to Sierra to Electronic Arts before finally reaching Warner Bros., which also controls the film property rights. The Lord of the Rings license has resided there ever since 2009. Several studios tackled the license under Warner Bros., releasing video games such as Aragorn's Quest, Middle-earth Defense, and War in the North. All three of these were forgettable, timid steps and didn't garner much praise. But then it was Monolith Productions' turn. The studio has an eclectic portfolio since its founding in 1994, with games such as The Matrix Online, Condemned, Fear, and Gotham City Imposters running the gamut of video game sensibilities. And of course, later this week, it's releasing Middle-earth: Shadow of War, the sequel to one of the best games to come from 2014. But when Monolith first got the chance to work with Middle-earth in 2012, these self-proclaimed Lord of the Rings geeks were eager, if also a little bit nervous. They were all too cognizant of the property's spotty history in games and knew they needed to do something different than the studios that came before them. At the time, games such as League of Legends and Dota 2 were flourishing, in the genre we know as multiplayer online battle arenas, or MOBAs for short. With such a rich cast of heroes, villains, and magical beings, the Lord of the Rings seemed tailor-made for MOBAs. So, Monolith set to work on Guardians of Middle-earth. It would be the first of 3 games set in Tolkien's world. And 5 years later, only days before the release of their third, we traveled to Kirkland, Washington to talk to Monolith about the challenges of adapting The Lord of the Rings, of making a licensed video game in general, and how their Middle-earth entries are leaving their own legacy in Tolkien's wake.
I guess my history with Middle-earth goes back to when I was 4. So my grandma was a teacher, so she was giving me books all the time from when I was tiny, and The Hobbit was like the second book she ever gave me. And so I just loved it and devoured that, and then immediately after read Lord of the Rings, and then read it again and again and again, right through up to my teenage years, and then devoured every other epic fantasy book ever that was available from the late 70s through to pretty much the present.
I grew up loving the books. I read The Hobbit when I was, probably 7 years old, and then the Lord of the Rings trilogy a few years after that, and loved all the illustrations that were done for the series, all the Lord of the Rings content. So I love John Howe, Alan Lee, the Hildebrands.
It's really hard to balance because at the core, the number one thing is you have to make a great game, but you have to make a great game that is incredibly respectful of the source material.
But more specifically, talking about, taking the lore and then expanding it, there is that authenticity component, but we always are asking ourselves the question of, could this exist in the world, and how do we justify these things existing in the world?
I think everything is reviewed by Warner Brothers, but also Middle-earth Enterprises. Like every line of dialogue goes through them.
Come, Talion, see through my eyes.
She
is not our ally.
You know, the story outlines are reviewed and we get feedback and respond to that. You know, there's always a bigger question when we want to use a famous character from the original IP. You know, we have Gollum.
The precious. It showed us. It showed us treasures of the bright master.
You know, like any relationship, when you're developing it, there's that period where you're developing trust, and you're trying to understand what the other party, you know, thinks is important, and you're trying to communicate what is important to you and the team.
Even more so after the success of Shadow of Mordor, I think that gave them a level of trust in how much we love the lore and how we're sort of really genuine in trying to do the best job we can. To some extent, it's not canon. Like, we've changed things on the timeline. It is another story that exists alongside the books and the movies. So it's really striking that balance, like any good adaptation has to do, of telling your own story, but really trying to capture what's strongest about the source material as well.
I was not one of those kids who read it when I was really young. You know, I kind of came to it later in life, you know, so in my 20s. It's interesting, now I have kids, and so I have an 8-year-old boy, and we finished The Hobbit last year, and we just worked our way through Fellowship, and so it's kind of fascinating to see him experience that for the first time. It's a good reminder of just sort of, you know, what happens in, you know, with adaptation, and just sort of that things exist differently. Every time you're recreating this story in a different medium, pacing changes, character emphasis changes, all of those things.
As a MOBA, Guardians of Middle-earth didn't require much narrative direction. It was a mashup of heroes fighting each other with very artificial rules, using powers and abilities loosely tied to Peter Jackson's movies. But when it came time for Monolith to leave Guardians of Middle-earth behind, it was faced with a new challenge. How do you actually add a new chapter to Tolkien's universe? How do you flesh out a fantasy world created at a time when video games barely existed? How do you put a real lasting stamp on the Lord of the Rings? Monolith's response, of course, was Shadow of Mordor.
You don't get that many opportunities in a lifetime to work in a beloved world as Middle-earth, and the focus is Mordor. And you know, not that much has been written about Mordor. You read Lord of the Rings, and there are a few conversations between orcs here and there. You go to Mordor, but the orcs are this kind of unknown population, and that's where we really dive in, and we get to create this culture and civilization around the orcs, and we put this undead man fighting this war, having to form alliances with orcs and battle against them, and it gives us the opportunity also to create, you know, new stories in this world that we really all love.
You know, we looked at Saruman's Uruk-hai slaughtering and getting into this fight with the orcs of Mordor as they're carrying Merry and Pippin, or all the orcs turning on each other and slaughtering each other in Cirith Ungol when Sam's going to rescue Frodo, and just think that being able to get these guys to turn on each other, kind of being the spark that sets off that chaos, that seemed like a really interesting angle.
We spend a lot of time ensuring that the leathers and the cloths and the armor and all of these elements are relative to the time period. And then when it comes to the environments, it's the same thing. We do an incredible amount of research. We do on-location shoots to ensure that things are authentic and look realistic.
And then the other thing we looked at is the number of times in both the books and the movies, it teases this idea of what would have happened if Boromir got the Ring of Power, what would have happened if Galadriel had taken the ring off Frodo and we'd had Dark Galadriel. So that teasing of someone with heroic goals but tempted down the road of using power and kind of fighting the Dark Lord head to head was a really interesting idea.
It's one thing to create a narrative that fits within the legacy of Middle-earth. It's another to make a fun game set within that world as well. But with Shadow of Mordor and its sequel, Monolith wanted to do something more. It wanted to tie its story and gameplay together. It wanted to give players the chance to pull their own story out of the one the team had put so much effort into crafting. Enter the Nemesis system.
Killed you? Now you're back? Just my rotten luck.
It was one of the most innovative mechanics of 2014, allowing enemy AI to adapt to your actions, remember your encounters, and act accordingly in the future. If an orc kills you, he'll be promoted. Fight him again later on, and he'll have the scars to show for it. Anyone who's played Shadow of Mordor can have their own unique worst enemy, with fears, habits, and memories of their own.
The Nemesis system is a massive effort across multiple teams, and so I think the first thing is that we just have to ensure that there's really good and regular communication between the key players. So the design group, our realization group that does all of the cameras and some of the animations, our animation group, our concept group, our character group that's building the content.
Because I think the seed of it, a lot of it really was in sports games.
And it's sent. Takes the shot, score!
I started off working on EA Sports games, and sports in general, not just sports video games, are actually really good at creating dynamic narratives around the interaction of these different characters.
Well, here are the New England Patriots, one win away from the second perfect season in NFL history, taking on a Giants team that started 0-2 this season, winners of 10 straight on the road, and they come rolling into this game with a lot of confidence.
And the thing I always really liked in sports seasons as well is, you know, you've got this beginning, you've got this escalation of drama that comes up through the finals, you know you've got the sort of this epic climax in the Super Bowl or whatever, so there's a narrative structure to it, but there's a lot of different ways that it can go along the way, and there's a lot of different individual rivalries and personalities. So in a lot of ways, the dynamic commentary in sports games and so on of keeping track of what you've done, and then when two teams meet again later of calling back to that is really powerful. Taking those ideas of a dynamic narrative and these procedural characters and putting them into an action adventure, that was really exciting.
How you move or I'll miss. I hate that.
The other sort of seed of it is going back again to pen and paper role-playing games, where they are always dynamic, and the most memorable characters are the guy who started as a random NPC that you met on the fly, but he managed to get the last hit in, and they're always more memorable and more meaningful than whatever the crafted narrative that the Dungeon Master wants to tell you is. We really are trying to create stories and emotional connections to these characters. So when there is a betrayal, or when you lose someone you're sort of attached to, or when you finally get revenge, it's a big emotional moment. So, you know, we've learned so much, and we've been doing this for 6 years now, and are still, I think, just at the beginning of what the possibilities are for where we can take it in the future.
When you look at someone's intention or someone's motivation, and two people can have very different viewpoints about what they were trying to accomplish, it lives on beyond the experience, rather than something that, like, okay, I've experienced that, completely digested it, and never have to think about it again. I think that's probably a mark of failure in a lot of ways, and it's what we've tried to avoid. We really want to put in as much content as possible that will really excite and motivate conversation and debate.
It's ironic that when trying to make a game based in the most famous fantasy world ever imagined, the members of Monolith decided to shy away from a traditional narrative. Rather than draw from something that happened in Tolkien's books or Peter Jackson's movies, or any of the numerous adaptations that have emerged from Middle-earth over the years, Monolith decided to go a different route, to make the players the storytellers. It's impossible to say what Tolkien would have thought about Lord of the Rings video games. He was famously critical of most illustrations and film scripts he had the chance to see before he died. And video games, at least most of the time, are inherently made to be fun. But regardless, Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, and Shadow of War are reminders of that letter Tolkien sent to his publisher. That desire to create an interconnected world that millions of people could share. When tasked with the challenge of bringing the most beloved fantasy story to life, and adding to that legend, Monolith's solution was simple. Let players tell this chapter themselves.